Hi, I'm Janet. Welcome to my kitchen. Today we're going to make a very simple crusty bread. But first, please click subscribe so that you can be notified of any future videos that I do. I'm focusing on making simple things at home using just the ingredients you have in your kitchen. Right now, with the coronavirus pandemic that has resulted in all the social distancing, a lot of people aren't going to the store, so they want to be able to make things with stuff they already have in their kitchen. So today we're going to make this very basic crusty bread. My husband and I have it multiple times a week. It's fantastic with stew, with hearty soups, even not hearty soups. It's just a really awesome bread to have on hand, and it freezes super well. So we're going to get started, and then we're going to backtrack and talk about some of the ingredients. But first of all, we start with 3 cups of warm water. We're talking, if you have a thermometer, between 105 and 110 degrees. That's bath water temperature. If you start getting much higher in the 120 degree range, then you're looking at potentially killing the yeast, and you don't want to do that. The yeast is one of the most important elements of your bread. So you start with 3 cups of bath water, warm water. And what I do is I swish hot water in my bowl before I put the warm water in, because if I get the water in the measuring cup to the right temperature and then I put it in a cold bowl, it drops the temperature. Not a huge amount, but maybe 4 or 5 degrees. So I'm going to start with a tablespoon and a half of instant yeast. So this is just the stuff you get at the grocery store. I buy it in a block at Costco. It's a vacuum sealed block. And I store it, once it's opened, I store it in my fridge. In a perfect world, I would always store all of it in the fridge, but I have a couple of blocks in my pantry storage, and I don't have room in my fridge to store all of that in the fridge. So I have a tablespoon and a half of just instant yeast. If you have cake yeast, you can use that. Just use the equivalent. That's something, I don't know that I've seen it around here, but I've seen it used in other parts of the world. And then you have just about a half a teaspoon or so of sugar. This is not mandatory, but it will help your bread, your yeast get going faster, and your dough will rise more quickly. So I sprinkle that on top, and then I can just let it sit. Now, if I have a whisk or a spatula, I can then stir that. I typically use a whisk, and I just want to mix that up so that it all gets wet and nice and bathed in that warm water. So you can leave that to sit, and what you're looking for is for the yeast to start growing, and the sugar gives it the food to help it grow. And you'll notice your kind of milky liquid is going to turn foamy on the top, and you'll get a good 1/4 inch layer of this foam on top, and that tells you that your yeast is alive. If you don't get that, don't go any further, because you'll be wasting your other ingredients. It takes 5, at the most 10 minutes to do that. Right now I have basically this milky liquid. Because I didn't use a whisk, I still have some clumps of yeast, and that's totally fine. If you have that, it's not going to hurt anything. So just let that sit. Set that aside. Let that sit for 5 to 10 minutes. In the meantime, we're going to talk about some of the other ingredients. Flour. This that I'm using right now is bread flour. The difference between all-purpose and bread flour is the protein level. I don't buy bread flour because I don't want to have to store all-purpose flour and bread flour. So I buy all-purpose flour, and I add what's called vital wheat gluten. And vital wheat gluten is an element of the wheat that has been refined down, and basically they've pulled out the gluten out of regular flour and concentrated it so you can buy just the vital wheat gluten. What gluten is a combination of two proteins, glutenin and gliadin, and when you combine them, they form gluten. Gluten is what gives your bread structure. Wheat does have gluten in it, or it has glutenin and gliadin, but not all grains do. So you have to be careful. If you're substituting other grains, you can only do so up to a certain percentage, usually a quarter to a third of alternate flours. Oat flour has no gluten in it. So, and I learned this by sore experience. I wanted to make a nice healthy oat bread, and I used 100% oat flour that I ground from oat groats, and I ended up with a brick. So don't do that. If you want to use other flours to augment this, just make sure that you don't go above at the absolute maximum 1/3 of those alternate flours. Now, I buy gluten and all-purpose flour and then mix them together. The ratio is 1 cup of all-purpose flour to 1 teaspoon of gluten, vital wheat gluten. You can buy vital wheat gluten at Lee's Marketplace. I also buy it online as well. But you have to mix it very, very well. And I use a whisk. So I'll mix up a whole batch of it. I'll layer it. And as I layer it, I whisk with a nice balloon whisk. If you were to get just gluten and get it wet, it will be like chewing gum, and you will never get it to incorporate into your bread. So you have to mix it up together. And that's what I've done here, is I took all-purpose flour and I added some gluten. Now, you can also use whole wheat flour. And this morning, I did a test to see what if I didn't add vital wheat gluten to whole wheat flour. So I ground my own flour out of my wheat berries, and I baked up actually 4 different loaves. So let me show you those. These 2 used whole wheat flour. This one did not use vital wheat gluten, and this one did. So you can see the difference in the size of the loaf. I measured them all out. I did not weigh them though, so there might be minor differences, but I measured them out using a measuring cup. And they ended up, pretty substantially different. So this one that is a little larger is going to have a little bit better rise because the gluten provides structure for the dough and the bread as it's baking. This one is going to be, that uses no vital wheat gluten, is still going to be edible. It's going to have the same flavor, but it will have a little bit different texture. It's going to be denser. Now this is the difference between using all-purpose flour with and without gluten. You really can't tell the difference. So if you're using all-purpose flour, unless you really want a super chewy bread, you probably don't even need to add the vital wheat gluten. I still probably will because I like the structure that it gives to my bread. But as far as huge differences, it's probably not going to make a big difference. Okay, one other thing about the flour, when you measure it, don't use the dip and sweep method, which is like this, and then you level it off. The dip and sweep method can give you up to 20% more flour. So I always take a scoop, I scoop into my flour bin, and I sprinkle it into the cup. I don't tap it to let it settle because, again, you're going to get more flour. And I had a friend who I taught how to make this bread. She came back to me just last week and said, I didn't need to put all the flour in, and it was really pulling away from the edge of the bowl. And then I discussed that with her, and she said that she used the dip and sweep method. And so she already had enough flour in her dough before she got to the recipe limit. So this recipe was was devised using the dip and sweep method. So I've got my my water and my yeast. It still needs to go a little bit further, so we're going to talk a little bit more about the sugar. Yeast needs some sort of food to grow. There are some natural sugars in wheat, and eventually the yeast will grow using those. It's going to take a really, really long time. Now you can make this bread and just keep the dough in the fridge, but if you do that, don't put any sugar in it because it will grow so fast. You'll have to punch it down about every 6 hours, even in the cold of your fridge. So if you want to leave the dough in the fridge and just rip off a hunk and bake it when you want hot, fresh bread, you can do that. Just don't put any sugar in it. But if you want bread right away, then you need to give it some food. I've done some little tests and I've used as little as a half a teaspoon, and that seems to be plenty. And I've used as much as a third of a cup. Now, if you're making a bread that has add-ons, if you want to put chopped, diced up dried cranberries and pecans, you can do that. And you'll want to up the sugar. Don't go much higher than a third of a cup. Sugar also aids in browning, and this is baked at a very high temperature, so you're going to get a really, really dark crust if you go beyond a third of a cup. And in fact, the inside might be a little too underdone before you get to your needed time. Let me restate that. Your crust may be way too dark before you get to the needed time to finish the inside baking. So we've got your sugar, any range from a half a teaspoon all the way to a third of a cup. And you can put that in right at the beginning. You can put in a half a teaspoon or a teaspoon just to feed the yeast, and then put the rest of the sugar in later. I've done both and it doesn't matter. Now our other ingredient is salt. This salt is kosher salt. And the printed recipe that was given to me called for 1.5 tablespoons. But since I bake the bread right away, it doesn't have time to develop that complex flavor that an artisan bread often has. Artisan breads often are left to rise overnight in the fridge, and that starts a fermentation process in the dough and gives you a more developed flavor. Well, if you're not doing that, you have to use a little bit more yeast to get, or I'm sorry, a little bit more salt to give your bread some, a little bit more flavor. The recipe initially called for a 1.5 tablespoons of kosher salt. I used 2 tablespoons. Now this kosher salt is kosher salt by definition is a larger flake. If you're using regular table salt that comes in the Morton canister, you will want to cut that in half and use 1 tablespoon. Otherwise, it will be way too salty because they measure very, very differently. We're not going to put this in until the end, after we've put in most of the flour, because salt inhibits yeast. And so you would never want to pour the salt directly in the water and yeast because they'll have direct contact. It'll be a very concentrated contact and could kill some of the yeast, and you don't want to do that. So we'll just set this aside and we'll put it in after we've put in most of the flour. You can do this by hand. It's much easier if you have a mixer. I have a 6-quart KitchenAid, and it can go through this, it can go through mixing this without any problems. I use the paddle attachment. I don't even have to use the dough hook. If you don't have a really powerful mixer, you're going to need to use the dough hook. But you can do this by hand. Your biggest risk is going to be, if you're doing it by hand, you will have a tendency to want to add more flour because it's going to be sticking to your hands. So the great thing about this bread is you don't even really have to knead it. You just need to knead it enough to come together. Now, if you do knead it, you're going to get a better structure. You're going to get it chewier. It's just all the way around going to be a little bit better. but you can do it with a hand mixer to a certain point. Then when it gets to be like cookie dough, then you'll want to turn it onto a board and knead in the rest by hand. And I will show you how to knead in just a minute. So again, if you're not using a stand mixer, your biggest risk is going to be that you add too much flour, and that will make for a very dry bread. So you can see I'm starting to develop this foam on top, and just in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and move further. So I can just dump this flour in. Typically, I dump in half, and then I mount it on the mixer and mix that in, then I add the rest. For our purposes, I'm just going to dump it in. And we'll mount it on the mixer. And again, I just use the paddle, and I don't even need to switch to the dough hook. If you have a less powerful mixer, you'll need to switch to the dough hook after about half the flour has been added. So I'm going to turn this on and just let it come together. And now I'll put in okay, now that is all that is really needed, but I'm going to let this go and on low speed and just knead for about 5 minutes, 10 maybe, because it will get a better structure. And so I'm going to let this go until it starts to develop webs or strands, and I will show you in a few minutes what that will look like. So stay tuned and we'll come back.